Well, as we've heard, and I agree with the chairman and the ranking member, the administration downplays concerns that Iran will use the sanctions relief it gets from the nuclear deal for its terror activities, instead arguing that the money will be used to shore up a failing Iranian economy. But as we've heard, the IRGC is one of the major actors in the Iranian economy, with a presence in nearly every sector. It has a particularly large presence in the same sectors that the administration is arguing that sanctions relief will go to: construction, infrastructure, energy, finance. The administration is telling only one small part of the story, and that we've only scratched the surface of what we should be sanctioning, including designating the IRGC and the Quds Force as foreign terrorist organizations. And Mr. Alfano, in your written testimony, you mentioned your colleague, Dr. Ottolenghi, who testified at our Middle East subcommittee on this IRGC issue 2 months ago, and you've both argued that the administration should be reporting on the IRGC in much greater detail, including the subsidiaries of IRGC parent companies, the companies that have an IRGC controlling interest, and the exact nature of the IRGC support to Assad. How effective can our remaining sanctions be if we're not targeting the IRGC subsidiaries and commercial interest? And for Mr. Medel, you highlighted the non-kinetic activities of the Quds Force, including its work in setting up religious organizations, foundations, cultural centers, and testified that progress on U.S. efforts to counter this irregular warfare has been very limited. And as Mr. Duncan continually points out, we've seen a lot of Iranian activity in the Western Hemisphere, throughout the Middle East, to set up these types of influence, destabilization, recruitment centers, but very little effort by us in the United States to counter this. What is Iran's strategic goal in all of this, and where has it been more active, and why have our efforts to counter Iranian influence in this arena been so ineffective? Mr. Alfano.
Thank you. This is a very, very important point that you are raising, Madam. The Revolutionary Guards, of course, is trying to hide its assets. You know, there are so many front companies that the Revolutionary Guards is constantly creating, and therefore the Treasury here in the U.S. must, of course, also be extremely vigilant and be careful that they do not create companies that we are unaware of. One of the good allies of the U.S. in this cat and mouse game, of course, is what remains of the private sector in Iran, because they certainly do believe that the Revolutionary Guards is trying to make their business impossible in Iran. And they also would be willing to cooperate identifying some of those companies of the Revolutionary Guards, which is constantly popping up. And as you also pointed out, many of these activities are going to, you know, the money that flows into Iran goes back to the Revolutionary Guards because of their activities, particularly in the construction sector. Khatam al-Anbiya construction headquarters of the Revolutionary Guards is the largest contractor in the entire Islamic Republic of Iran. Most of the public projects, development projects in Iran, are handed over to the Khatam al-Anbiya construction base on no-bid basis. So the private sector has no say. If they do participate in those projects, it is as subcontractors to the Revolutionary Guards.
Thank you, and I'm going to interrupt you here to give a minute to Mr. Medel.
Thank you for your question. One of the things I think is when you think about the way that Iran externalizes revolution, when you think about when Iran goes into a place like Iraq or Syria or Yemen, anywhere else, there's a lot of building from the ground up. So when I mention religious centers, mosques, cultural centers, and so forth, I think that that's a firm belief that, like Mr. Alfano suggested, it's more than just about terrorism and subversion. It's about actually altering the fabric of the places where they want to have control and influence in. So when they go and do this, it requires a lot of money. So when you think about the money that it takes to do this, one thing I would mention is a lot of people are speculating as to whether or not the Iranian government is going to take this windfall that it's going to get from sanctions relief and direct it into the IRGC or the MOIS and other security elements of the government. I think, and Mr. Al-Faneh might be among them, people have written about the fact that after the negotiations began in 2014, the RGC budget went up. The Ministry of Intelligence budget went up, and this was just in anticipation of sanctions relief. This was publicly stated. This was publicly declared. So I think if you're asking yourself how the Iranians are going to spend the money, they've already been very clear in indicating it. But again, it's not, and I agree with Ambassador Benjamin that it is cheap to pull off a terrorist attack or to do subterfuge, but we're talking about something that's much more transformational than that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.